The orderly's fingers dug into my jaw, forcing the syringe between my teeth. I bit down, blood and glass. The sharpened spoon was still hidden in my sleeve, but the clock was ticking. If I didn't get to the medication cart before morning rounds, they'd erase another piece of me. My brother's voice echoed in the hall. "Just one more dose, Sarah." The vial in my hand wasn't medicine. It was poison, and I was the only one who knew. The linoleum floor hummed under Sarah's palms, vibrating with the heavy, rhythmic thuds of orderly Miller's boots. His shadow stretched across the corridor wall, a distorted giant looming over the industrial tile of the Willow Crest Institute. Sarah pressed her spine against the cold brick of the alcove, the scent of bleach and stale sweat clogging her throat. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She simply calculated the distance between the predator and the prey. Miller's breathing sounded like a bellows, ragged and wet. He gripped a heavy ring of keys that jingled with every predatory step, a metallic clink, clink, clink that acted as a metronome for Sarah's rising panic. She reached into her pocket, her thumb finding the smooth, cool surface of her riverstone. She tapped it against her thigh. 2, 3, 5, 7. The prime numbers were the only things that kept the walls from closing in. This wing followed the 1954 blueprints: load-bearing pillars every 12 feet, recessed maintenance hatches disguised by decorative molding. She knew the geometry of her cage better than the men who guarded it. Her fingers brushed the jagged edge of the silver spoon tucked into her waistband. Cold metal bit into her skin, a sharp reminder of the tools she had spent 3 nights grinding against the concrete floor of the communal shower. She reached upward, her fingertips finding the loose corner of the ventilation grate. The screws turned with a faint, metallic groan that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the hallway. "Where is she?" Miller's voice rasped, thick with a smoker's phlegm. Sarah slid the sharpened handle into the dark cavity of the duct, wedging it behind a rusted support beam. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Miller swung his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom inches from her toes. She exhaled through her nose, silent and shallow. The spoon sat secure in its hiding spot, a silver splinter of hope buried in the gut of the asylum. As the heavy boots retreated toward the nurse's station, Sarah let her bruised knuckles relax. The hunt continued, but she held the map. The retreat of Miller's footsteps left a vacuum of silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the building's cooling system. Sarah stepped out of the shadows, her eyes scanning the hallway for the next variable. The air here was thin, scrubbed of life by high-grade filters, smelling of nothing but floor wax and the faint, ozone tang of electric lights. A shadow flickered at the end of the ward. Sarah froze, her hand flying back to the stone in her pocket. 11, 13, 17. But the figure wasn't Miller. It was a woman, shorter and slighter, moving with a weary grace that didn't belong to the guards. A nurse's uniform, starched and white, rustled softly as she approached. It was Nurse Maria Rodriguez. Maria didn't call out. She didn't blow her whistle. Instead, she reached for the heavy silver crucifix hanging at her throat, pulling it tight until the chain bit into her skin. Her eyes, framed by deep, exhausted wrinkles, searched Sarah's face with a look that wasn't clinical. It was morning. "Sarah," Maria whispered, her voice barely a vibration in the air. "You need to listen. I checked the logs, the digital ledger." Sarah stiffened. "The math doesn't change, Maria. My records are fixed." "They aren't," Maria said, her voice trembling. "Your blood results, the ones from Tuesday morning that showed the levels of the medicine were toxic, they're gone. Someone typed a command that made the files vanish. It's like they never existed. The system refuses to recognize them, like a locked door with the wrong key. The smell of lavender, faint and out of place against the bleach, wafted from Maria's skin. It was the scent of Sarah's childhood, of a home that had been dismantled piece by Julian's greed. Maria leaned in closer, her breath warm against Sarah's ear. "Forgive me, James," she murmured, a plea to Sarah's dead father. "I should have spoken sooner. Julian isn't just keeping you here, he's deleting you." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The Institute wasn't just a prison, it was a giant eraser. Every day she spent here, another line of her identity was being rubbed out of the world's blueprints. A sudden, piercing wail shattered the conversation. The fire alarm. It was a jagged, mechanical scream that vibrated through the floorboards and into the marrow of Sarah's bones. Red lights began to pulse along the ceiling, casting the hallway in rhythmic, bloody flashes. "Go!" Maria hissed, shoving Sarah toward the main hallway. "The drill. It's the only time the internal locks release. The doors go into a fail-safe mode, swinging open so the patients don't burn." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She ran. The hallway was a chaos of white-clad bodies and shouting guards. Patients were being herded like cattle toward the courtyards, their faces pale and vacant under the strobing lights. Sarah didn't follow the crowd. She mapped the trajectory of the medication cart she knew would be stationed near the west exit. The cart sat abandoned in the middle of the corridor, its heavy steel drawers glinting under the emergency lights. The nurse in charge had fled toward the exit, leaving the keys dangling from the side. Sarah lunged for it. Her fingers, nimble from years of handling drafting tools, felt the tumblers click as she turned the key. The drawer slid open with a metallic hiss. Rows of small glass vials sat nestled in foam. She scanned the labels, her eyes moving with the speed of a computer processor. Sterling S. Stabilizer, 10 milligrams. She grabbed the vial, the cold glass biting into her palm. This was it. The physical proof. If she could get this liquid to an outside lab, she could prove they were pumping her full of something that wasn't meant to heal. She tucked the vial into her sock, the hard cylinder pressing against her ankle bone. She had the evidence. Now, she just had to survive the basement. The smoke wasn't real, just a chemical fog released for the drill. But it tasted like burnt plastic and old dust. Sarah ducked into the service stairwell, her boots clattering against the metal steps. She needed to reach the laundry room. The blueprints showed a delivery chute there that led directly to the loading docks. It was a straight line to the world outside. The basement was a cavern of concrete and thrumming machinery. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp cotton and industrial soap. Giant steel dryers, the size of small cars, roared with a low-frequency growl that made Sarah's teeth ache. She was halfway across the floor when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of linen crates. He wasn't wearing a nurse's uniform or an orderly's scrubs. He wore a janitor's jumpsuit, but it fit him poorly across his massive, muscular shoulders. A jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow, and he was cracking his knuckles one by one in a loud, wet-sounding sequence. He didn't speak. He just moved. Sarah dodged a heavy swing that would have shattered her jaw. She scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the soapy floor. The man, a hired thug, she realized, not a janitor, lunged again. He was like a landslide, heavy and unstoppable. Sarah's hand hit the top of an industrial ironing press. It was hot, radiating a shimmering wall of heat. She grabbed the heavy metal handle, the heat-resistant grip scorching her palm. As the man lunged, She swung the iron with every ounce of leverage her frame could muster. The heavy metal plate connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled, his body hitting the concrete like a sack of wet grain. He was out cold. Sarah stood over him, her chest heaving, the smell of singed hair and hot metal filling her nostrils. She reached into her sock and pulled out the vial. She held it up to the dim light of the basement, expecting to see the clear, amber hue of her stabilizer. Her heart stopped. As her thumb brushed the label, the edge peeled back. It had been lazily glued over another sticker. Beneath the fake stabilizer tag was a stark red warning. Compound 92B. Experimental dissociative. Not for human consumption. The vial began to shake in her hand. This wasn't the medicine she had been prescribed. It was a powerful hallucinogen, a chemical sledgehammer designed to shatter a person's perception of reality. Julian wasn't just sedating her to keep her quiet. He was using the Institute to manufacture a version of her that was truly, undeniably insane. The evidence she had risked her life to steal wasn't a shield. It was the very weapon Julian would use to bury her forever. If she were found with this, it wouldn't prove her sanity. It would prove she was a drug-addled danger to herself. She was standing in the dark, holding the proof of her own destruction. The heavy, wet thud of the unconscious man's breathing was the only sound in the humid basement. Sarah felt the world tilt. The geometry of the room, once so clear and logical, began to warp at the edges. Was it the fumes? Or was the mere presence of the vial enough to infect her mind? She tucked the vial back into her waistband, her fingers trembling. She couldn't stay here. The fire drill was ending. The mechanical locks would soon click back into place, sealing the hive. She scrambled back up the service stairs, her mind racing through the math of her survival. 2, 3, 5, 7. The numbers felt smaller now, less like a shield and more like a countdown. By the time she reached her ward, the red lights had stopped pulsing. The hallway was returning to its sterile, suffocating beige. She slipped into her room, sliding the vial into the hollow space behind the baseboard, just as the heavy door groaned open. Julian stood there. He looked as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom on State Street. His bespoke navy suit was crisp, his silver cufflinks perfectly parallel to his sleeves. He was flipping a silver coin, a 1924 peace dollar, catching it and slapping it onto the back of his hand. Heads. It was always heads. Beside him stood a small, nervous man in a cheap polyester suit, clutching a briefcase like a life preserver. A notary. "You look a bit disheveled, Sarah," Julian said, his voice a syrupy, manipulative purr. He stepped into the room, his presence instantly making the space feel smaller, more pressurized. "The fire drill must have been quite upsetting for you. We don't like loud noises, do we?" "No, not at all." Sarah stood by the window, her posture rigid. "The fire drill was a lapse in security, Julian, a variable you didn't account for." Julian sighed, a soft, performative sound. Always the architect, always looking for the cracks in the foundation. "But I'm afraid the foundation has shifted. This is Mr. White. He's here to witness some signatures." Mr. White, the notary, adjusted his tie exactly 3 times. He wouldn't look Sarah in the eye. He was focused on the floor, his left eye twitching rhythmically. "The hearing has been moved, Sarah," Julian continued, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold ambition. "The judge had a sudden opening in his docket. 48 hours from now. The court will decide on the permanent guardianship. We want to make sure the transition is smooth, seamless." "Permanent?" Sarah's voice cracked. You're trying to strip my legal autonomy before the internal audit of the firm is complete. The firm is handled, dear sister. Handled. You just need to rest. A long, quiet, heavy rest. Julian turned to the notary. She's having one of her episodes. The spatial fixation. It's quite sad, isn't it? Julian left her then, the metallic clink of his coin echoing in the hallway long after the door clicked shut. Sarah was alone in the silence, but the silence was a lie. She could feel the walls watching her. The next morning, the psychological warfare began in earnest. Sarah returned from the communal breakfast to find her room transformed. It wasn't that things were missing. It was that they were wrong. Her bed had been moved 3 inches to the left. Her drafting table had been rotated 45 degrees. The small, smooth river stone she kept on her bedside table was gone, replaced by a jagged, ugly piece of concrete. She ran to the wall clock. It said 10:15. She looked at the clock in the hallway through the small observation window. It said 2:30. The math is failing, she whispered, her fingers frantically searching for the prime number sequence on her thigh. She had no stone. She had no anchor. She saw Dr. Eris Thorne standing in the doorway. He was a man who looked like he was made of yellowed parchment and nicotine stains. He was obsessively cleaning his glasses with a silk cloth, his eyes squinting at her with clinical detachment. "You seem distressed, Sarah," Thorne said. He began to walk across the room. 1, 2, 3. He reached 12 steps and stopped. Then he frowned, turned back to the door, and started over. "You moved my furniture," Sarah accused, her voice rising. "You're changing the clocks." "The clocks are perfectly synchronized, Sarah," Thorne lied, his voice flat. "Perhaps your perception of time is fracturing. It's a common symptom of the chemical imbalance we're trying to treat. The brain begins to misinterpret the blueprints of reality." He stepped closer, the smell of stale tobacco clinging to his lab coat. "I've ordered a change in your regimen. We need to ensure you're properly hydrated for the hearing, a forced hydration session, to clear the clutter from your mind." Sarah backed away, but 2 orderlies were already behind her. One of them was Miller. He was grinning, his heavy boots squeaking on the linoleum. They dragged her to the infirmary, a room that smelled of sharp antiseptic and old fear. They strapped her to a cold metal gurney, the leather restraints biting into her wrists and ankles. A tray of glass vials sat on a mobile cart next to her head. "No," Sarah grunted, fighting the straps. "I know what you're doing. I have the vial. I know about compound 92B. Thorne paused, his fingers hovering over a needle. He looked at Miller. A silent communication passed between them, a flicker of genuine alarm. "She's hallucinating again," Thorne said, though his voice had lost its steady rhythm. "The agitation is reaching peak levels." As Miller leaned over to tighten the chest strap, Sarah saw her opening. She couldn't break the leather, but she could move the cart. She kicked out with her right foot, her heel catching the leg of the metal stand. The cart toppled. Glass shattered against the floor like 1,000 tiny bells. Vials of clear liquid exploded into shards, splashing Thorne's shoes. "Damn it!" Thorne hissed, stepping back from the mess. In the chaos, as the orderlies scrambled to clean the glass and Thorne cursed his ruined shoes, Sarah's hand brushed the floor. Her fingers closed around something small and sharp. A discarded syringe, its plastic casing cracked, but its needle intact. She slid it into the waistband of her scrubs, the cold metal a secret sting against her skin. They eventually got the IV in, a cold flood of fluid entering her vein that made her feel heavy and slow. But as they wheeled her back to her room, she felt a grim spark of victory. She had a weapon now, and she wasn't the only one who knew Julian's secrets. That evening, the air in the ward grew heavy with the scent of lavender. Maria Rodriguez slipped into Sarah's room, her face pale in the moonlight, filtering through the barred window. "He's coming for you tonight," Maria whispered. She was clutching her crucifix so hard her knuckles were white. "Julian. He knows you found the laundry room. He knows you're not as gone as the drugs should make you." Sarah sat up, the heaviness of the IV fluid making her head swim. "Why are you helping me, Maria? This isn't just about the medical logs. You talk to my father in the dark. You say his name like a prayer." Maria looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I loved him, Sarah. For 20 years, I was the shadow in his life. The one he came to when the sterling name became too heavy to carry. I watched Julian grow into a monster, and I did nothing because I wanted to keep my place in the margins. But James, your father, he wanted you to have the firm. He saw the logic in you. He saw the light." Maria reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, black device and a plastic bag containing a needle and a vacuum tube, a digital recorder, and a blood draw kit. "If you can get a clean sample of your blood before the hearing, before they pump you full of the 92B, we can prove the fraud." Sarah took the items, her fingers brushing Maria's. "You're risking everything." "I'm atoning," Maria said. "But be careful, Sarah. The man you fought in the basement, he wasn't just a thug. He's a private investigator Julian's had on his payroll for years. His name is Henderson. He's the one who finds the evidence that makes people disappear. If the judge doesn't bury you, Henderson will." Maria vanished back into the shadows, leaving Sarah with the tools of her salvation. But as Sarah looked at the blood kit, a cold dread settled in her gut. She had the recorder. She had the needle. But she was trapped in a building where the walls were designed to swallow sound. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated resistance. Sarah spent every moment she was alone in the bathroom, sticking her finger down her throat, purging the vitamins and the hydration fluids they forced into her. She needed her mind sharp. She needed the math to be perfect. She hid the recorder in the stuffing of her pillow, capturing the muffled voices of the guards, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of Thorne's 12-step walk, and the chilling, whispered threats Julian delivered during his wellness visits. On the final night, the door to her cell didn't groan. It opened silently, a sliver of hallway light cutting across the floor. Julian stepped in. He wasn't wearing his suit. He wasn't. He was in shirt sleeves, his tie loosened, his eyes dark with a desperate, frantic energy. He didn't have his coin. "You're a stubborn thing, Sarah," he said, his voice no longer syrupy. It was jagged, like broken glass. "You always were. Even when we were children, you'd spend hours staring at those blueprints, finding the one structural fluke that would make the whole thing fall down. You think you found the fluke here, don't you?" He walked toward the bed. Sarah tensed, her hand sliding under the pillow toward the shard of the drafting pencil she had managed to keep hidden since her first day. A long, yellow splinter of graphite and wood. "The judge is a friend, Sarah," Julian said, standing over her. "He played golf with Father. He's already signed the papers. The hearing is just theater. A puppet show for the state investigators." He reached out, his hand hovering over her face. "But I can't have you speaking. Not even a word. Because even a crazy person can say something that sticks. Something that makes people look closer at the books." Suddenly, Julian lunged. He grabbed the pillow from beneath her head and slammed it down over her face. The world went black. The scent of stale feathers and Julian's expensive laundry detergent filled her lungs. She couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 2, 3, 5, 7. The rhythm of a dying engine. She clawed at his arms, but he was heavier, fueled by the terror of losing his inheritance. "Just sleep, Sarah," he hissed through the pillow. "It's a quiet, heavy rest, just like I told you." Sarah's vision began to spark. Red dots danced in the darkness. She felt her strength fading, her fingers numbing. But then, her hand found the drafting pencil. She didn't aim for his chest. She knew the geometry of the human body. She aimed for the soft tissue of his shoulder, the gap between the muscle and the bone. She thrust the pencil upward with every remaining ounce of her will. Julian let out a strangled scream. The pressure on the pillow vanished as he recoiled, clutching his shoulder. Blood, dark and thick in the moonlight, began to seep through his white shirt. Sarah rolled off the bed, gasping for air, her lungs burning. She stood in the corner, the sharpened pencil held out like a dagger. You bitch," Julian wheezed, his face contorted in pain. He looked at the blood on his hands, his eyes wide with shock. He had never been the one to bleed. He was the one who watched from the shadows. "The math changed, Julian," Sarah said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "You forgot to account for the resistance of the material." Julian backed toward the door, his hand clamped over his wound. "It doesn't matter. You're still going to that courtroom, and you're going to look exactly like the monster I told them you are." He slammed the door, the lock clicking into place with a finality that felt like a tombstone being set. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, gray light. Sarah was exhausted, her body bruised and her mind fraying at the edges. But she was lucid. She had used the blood kit Maria provided, drawing a small vial of her own clean blood and hiding it, along with a digital recorder, in the lining of the wheelchair the orderlies brought for her. They strapped her in. They didn't use leather this time. They used heavy nylon webbing that pulled her shoulders back and forced her head upright. She looked like a doll, a silent, staring thing of wood and paint. As they rolled her down the hallway, she saw Maria Rodriguez standing by the nurse's station. Maria didn't look at her. She was whispering to herself, her hand clutching her crucifix. "Forgive me, James. Forgive me." The courthouse was a monument to oppressive power. Mahogany walls rose like cliffs toward a vaulted ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and floor wax. Judge Robert Thompson sat on the high bench, his face like a melting candle, his eyes fixed on the pocket watch he held in his hand. Clack! He snapped the watch shut. "We are here to determine the legal status of Sarah Sterling," the judge boomed, his voice echoing in the empty chamber. There was no jury, no public, only Julian, sitting at the petitioner's table with a bandage hidden under his suit jacket, and Dr. Thorne, who was nervously polishing his glasses. "The medical reports are quite clear," the judge continued, not even looking at Sarah. "The patient is experiencing a total break from reality. She is a danger to herself and the Sterling estate." Sarah sat in the wheelchair, her mind racing. She could feel the digital recorder pressing against her hip. She could feel the metal fragment she had pried from the wheelchair's armrest hidden in her palm. She looked at the wall jack near her feet, the connection point for the courtroom's integrated AV system. She had studied the blueprints of this building years ago. She knew how the wires ran. She knew that the emergency broadcast system was tied into the same circuit as the stenographer's microphone. The judge picked up his gavel. "I see no reason to delay. I hereby grant the petition for permanent guardianship." "Wait," Sarah said. Her voice was thin, but it cut through the room like a blade. Julian smirked. She's having a lucidity spike, Your Honor. It's part of the cycle. She'll be screaming about blueprints in a moment. I'm not screaming, Sarah said, leaning forward as much as the straps would allow. I'm calculating. She dropped the metal fragment. It slid perfectly into the gap of the wall jack. A sharp, electric pop echoed through the room. A smell of ozone and burnt plastic wafted from the wall. Suddenly, the overhead speakers, the ones meant for fire drills and emergency announcements, erupted with sound. It was Julian's voice. The judge is a friend, Sarah. He's already signed the papers. The hearing is just theater. The courtroom went dead silent. The judge froze, his gavel hovering in midair. Julian's face went from smug satisfaction to a sickly, pale gray. The recording continued. Dr. Thorne's voice joined in. Well, the 92B is working perfectly. Her blood will show exactly what we want it to show. We're deleting her, Julian. Piece by piece. Turn that off, the judge roared, slamming his gavel. Bailiff, shut that down. But Sarah wasn't finished. She began to speak, her voice steady and loud, drowning out the chaos. The Willow Crest Institute is located at 442 Oak Street. It was built in 1954. The load-bearing walls are reinforced concrete, 12 inches thick. The ventilation ducts are 24 by 24 inches, running on a centralized HVAC system with 3/4-inch steel support beams. The pharmacy is located in room 102, secured by a grade 4 Schlage lock. The medical records are stored on a local server with a bypass code of 8824. She looked directly at the judge. Does that sound like a woman who has lost her mind? Or does it sound like a woman who has mapped every inch of the prison you tried to bury her in? The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a rumpled suit with a persistent cough stepped in. David Henderson. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 state troopers. Judge Thompson. Henderson said, his voice a low, mourning hum. I think we need to have a conversation about these medical reports. And about the blood sample Miss Rodriguez just handed over to the state lab. The collapse was swift. Julian tried to run, but the pain in his shoulder made him stumble, and the troopers caught him before he reached the side exit. Dr. Thorne simply sat down, his glasses falling from his hand and shattering on the mahogany floor. Sarah sat in the wheelchair, the nylon straps finally being cut away by a young officer. She stood up, her legs shaky but her spine straight. A week later, Sarah Sterling stood on the steps of the Sterling mansion. The air was cold, a biting 62 degrees, and a thin layer of frost was already forming on the windows. She looked at the grand piano in the foyer. She looked at the bone-white keys. She looked at the portrait of her father hanging over the mantel. The math is finally stable, she whispered. She didn't stay. She signed the final deed of sale, handing the keys to a developer who planned to turn the estate into a public park. She didn't want the money. She didn't want the legacy. She wanted the clearance. She moved to a small, sunlit studio in Boston. There were no mahogany walls, no soundproof glass, just a drafting table, a set of professional pens, and a large window that looked out over the city. She sat at the table, a clean sheet of vellum spread out before her. She picked up a pen, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hand. She didn't draw a skyscraper. She didn't draw a prison. She began to sketch the foundation for a sanctuary, a place with thick walls and hidden exits, a place where the silence was safe and the math was always, undeniably, true. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth riverstone. She placed it on the corner of the table. 2, 3, 5, 7. The sequence was complete. She was finally home. The sun was setting over the Boston skyline, casting long, architectural shadows across Sarah's new studio. The room smelled of fresh ink and cedar shavings. Down on the street, the rhythmic honk of a taxi sounded, a low, staccato pulse that Sarah didn't find threatening. It was just another variable in a world she finally understood how to navigate. She looked at her hands. The scars from the restraints were fading, but the calluses from her drafting tools were returning. She was no longer a patient. She was no longer an heir. She was a builder. She picked up her pen and drew a single, perfect line. It was a load-bearing wall. It was a shield. It was the beginning of a life that no one could ever delete again. The digital recorder sat on the shelf, its red light dark, its job finished. Julian was in a cell that followed a very different set of blueprints. Dr. Thorne was facing a board of ethics that would ensure he never touched a needle again. And Maria Rodriguez. Maria was finally at peace. Living in a small cottage by the sea, her crucifix no longer a weight around her neck. Sarah exhaled, a long, quiet breath that filled the room. The air was clear. The geometry was sound. The story was hers to write. The end.